All right, I think we're live. Well, I think we're going to let some people filter in. Hey to everyone who's joined so far. But we'll be starting the conversation maybe a minute or so. Let's just let folks filter in before we get started. But Lewis, how are you, man? How's life on your end?
All good, all good. Thanks a lot for having me. Excited to be here.
Yeah, man. Always good to see you. And you're calling in from Switzerland, right?
Indeed, I'm in the so-called crypto valley right now here in Switzerland in a tiny place called Zug, which actually, it does harbor a couple of crypto companies, famously the Ethereum Foundation
Yep.
started here. I think they technically still are here.
Mhm.
And Web3 Foundation. I think I've seen someone from Cardano here before at some point. There's people there as well,
Yeah.
actually. And actually recently I noticed some Norwegian people are moving here. I think Norway introduced some crazy tax or something. For example, the Dune founders, I think I've seen around here now, and the Safe team,
Yep.
whom I know pretty well from back in the day when Gelato was still in Berlin, like when we started, Hilma and I coding on it in full node in Berlin. So they also opened an office here now in Zug. Slowly but surely there's real people here as well. But Zug, of course, is a very internationally, a place that companies like to reside in. I would say, let's put it
Yep.
this way.
And is most of the team based in Switzerland?
So we started fully remote always. It's always been pretty random where sort of we just met people on the internet and interviewed them and so on, and hired based off that, not based on time zones or anything like that. So we are still pretty remote, but now that we've been here in Switzerland for 3 years, we have formed a bit of a small core here in Switzerland. So definitely some people will be here as well. Here, but overall, the bigger share of the project is still not in Switzerland, like scattered across Europe, North America, South America,
Awesome.
Asia. Yeah.
Cool, man. How big's the team now?
We're we just for the first time hit 40 the 40 people head count. Yeah.
That's great, man. Well, I think it's, we've got some folks filtered in, so maybe we get the show on the road. Everyone, welcome. My name's Kyle Rojas. I lead the business team here at Avail. And I know normally the legendary Naruto and QEDK are hosting these, but I thought I'd bring in the B Squad. And I thought it'd be fun to join this one as I get to talk to my friend Luis, one of the founders of the incredible team of builders over at Gelato, which I've known and actually worked with for years now, even before joining Avail. Luis, welcome to the party and appreciate you being here, man.
Thanks, Kyle. And indeed, it's been a pleasure to be talking to you, working with you in the last years.
Yeah,
Happy
man.
to be here.
Maybe we kick it off with just your story, right? I'd love to hear all about your journey and then really what you did before even joining crypto and then before starting Gelato.
Yeah. I joined crypto in sort of 2016. I think the first time I ever saw Bitcoin, Litecoin, Ethereum, and so on was in 2015 in some weird shop in Spain. And they accepted the guy in the shop who was selling like weird stuff. He accepted Dogecoin and Ethereum back then. So this guy must be like a billionaire now. I think actually I should go back to that shop and see if he's still there or if he sold everything. I don't know. But yeah, so that was the first time. And then 2016, we were studying masters, and there was this guy from Mastercard. And he basically explained to us what blockchain is. He was back then, it was like the phase where it was blockchain, not Bitcoin, and consensus and enterprises and so on. And he actually explained to us what it was. Before that, to be honest, I was still pretty young. So I was just getting out of uni, just had my first job in a startup in Berlin. Before that, I lived in London for like 6 years, studying there and going to school there. So pretty much, I guess my second job already was then in crypto. That was after I'd already gotten into crypto in 2016, 17. I'd already bought some ETH. I'd already read some papers. I was like in the depth of GitHub, reading like Vitalik's GitHub comments, like lurking there, and actually writing a paper about Ethereum Casper proof of stake plans back then, and Lisk. And that was all in Berlin. Then got my first job in crypto as like basically a consultancy, and we worked with big companies, like huge international companies, like pharma companies and so on here in Switzerland and Germany. And then from there, just hired a bunch of devs. Eventually, really like made friends with them. Was super interested in what they were doing, and eventually I got bored with my sort of managerial job and quit and just taught myself how to code. And Hilmar did the same, my co-founder. We were basically always doing everything together, even then. And then our first software project was once we learned or taught ourselves how to code, it was pretty obvious that we wanted to do something with that in crypto. And then literally half year only, or like even less into coding, we just then applied for a grant from Gnosis to build something with Solidity for their Dutch X, which is, I guess nowadays it's sort of like house swap, you could say. And back then it was Dutch X, and that turned out to be Gelato, and which was in its initial form smart contract automation. But this ain't even our final form yet. So we have changes, and obviously since last year also doing a Rollup as a service. That's the hottest new thing.
Yeah, I want to dive into that. Like, so you said smart contracts and general, and you've done so many different things, which I want to dive into. But what was the story behind the founding of Gelato? What was the original vision? What were you planning to build when just starting out?
Yeah, it's actually, it's very maybe encouraging for some people that are just wanting to get started and so on. And literally for us, it was like the first coding project. We just decided that we wanted to learn how to code. We learned how to code, had lots of fun with it, right? And then immediately said, okay, cool. When you can code, you can immediately apply it, right? And especially in crypto. And we just applied for a grant so that because we didn't have a salary anymore, because we quit our jobs and so on, right? So we were like, okay, how can we code but still somehow survive like on food and stuff? So we just applied for a grant. And that was in the depth of the bear market of 2019. And Gnosis, actually, they were pretty cool already, pretty well funded then. They came out of the 2017-16 ICO craze, right? And they had this grant program back then, and we actually applied for it. And I think by far we were the least qualified coders among the applicants, but we were able to, at least articulate what we wanted to build and really sell it, and had a good idea, to be honest, as well, for automating stuff. So that's how Gelato really started. Was like literally we were trying to solve one problem, and that we got a grant for with Gnosis, and essentially realized that there was a much bigger problem underneath. The lack of generalized smart contract automation on Ethereum, right? Like Uniswap and so on, like they never really had limit orders, and these type of very normal things on centralized servers didn't exist in the decentralized realm, because blockchains have infinite compute, they have gas limits, they have block limits, whatnot, right? So you cannot just run a program forever in a smart contract that doesn't work this way. So we had to sort of supplant that and sort of bring that server automation style back into the mix without doing away with the properties of self-custody or non-custodialness and decentralization and so on. And that's essentially what we invented with Gelato, was like the first real fully fledged smart contract automation protocol. And that's how we started it. And from there, we just incrementally realized, okay, we can also do transaction relaying, account abstraction. All of these things are very much related to each other. And even our most recent addition, so Rollup as a service, is like not a pivot at all. It's like, if you look at the chains that are going live today, like Raya, for example, last week, and Real, formerly Tangible, like Real, all of these chains are not just coming to us for the block space, for the L2s, they are also coming to us because they are also using Web3 functions, right? Like, or Relay. And for example, Raya is an amazing example. They launched their sort of perpetual DEX chain and ecosystem last week, and they're like, all of their transactions from users are all going via Gelato Relay APIs. All of their sort of Oracle updates on the chain are going via Web3 functions, and I think it's Redstone, I believe, the Oracle provider. And so that's really like what we're doing there. It's sort of all of the work we did previous to RAS is now very like conducive to what we're doing. We're all bundling it up, and it's not just another RAS provider. It's really more like almost like you can think of it as like a Web3 cloud platform, like AWS, where you can pick your favorite execution layer stacks like Arbitrum, OP, Polygon, what have you. More coming soon, right? And you can pick your data availability layer, like Avail, and you can go and pick from third-party services. You can take Gelato services. We have our amazing serverless environment, Web3 functions, which we also pioneered, which is very, you can liken it to AWS Lambda, right? So
Mhm.
so all of this is like, it's essentially our goal is to make block space super commoditized, super easy to deploy, to still have decentralized solutions like Avail available, right? If you need them for higher value use cases and so on, but also like if you want to just build a game or something, you don't need immediately decentralization, just, you know, deploy something very simple. And to have all of this available, and make it super easy for developers to get access to this and to play with this, deploy this, and yeah, at the end of the day, just to make block space like commoditized ultimately and fully automated, and have less friction points for you to deploy a chain. At some point, you shouldn't have to talk to anyone anymore. You shouldn't have to ask anyone for permission or whatnot. You just, you know, you pick your stack and you deploy it, and you test your app, and if you like it, you bring it to market, and hopefully you become the next big thing, right? That's the idea.
Yeah, I love, there's a couple really cool lessons in there. One is that if people are starting out and they don't know how, getting a grant or even being part of a hackathon and winning there with a product, those end up sometimes becoming the biggest players in the entire space. And so I think that's cool that you guys started that way. Um, you know, what I think I've always loved about your team is that you're just such incredible builders, and the products you all built, like you said, Web3 functions and others, are just incredible tech, and they've seen some really solid adoption. And some people might not know that you also founded Arrakis, right? Something different entirely. Can you take me through any of the, you already mentioned some products, but maybe all the products your team's built over the years, and what those solutions are doing around the Web3 ecosystem? So how they're being used in different places.
Yeah. So initially we started with a smart contract protocol, and back then we were, you know, like first time Solidity developers, so we were obsessing about Solidity. And back then in 2019, you try to do everything on chain, because off chain was like a forbidden word. And nowadays people are way more comfortable with off chain technologies, like technically rollups like L2s can be considered off chain technologies, right? And yeah, so depending on what perspective you take, of course, but yeah, so first version of Gelato was way over engineered, everything on chain, smart contract protocol. It was pretty cool. It worked, right? Like we actually had some early integrations, like I think, I mean, we had the alpha ready in January or like December 2019, something like this. We got some grants back then also from Meta Cartel and so on. And then yeah, we like had some projects already using it, like Kyber and BZX and so on. But yeah, from there, like the one of the biggest unlocks I had like back then, and as like a, you know, developer, was, hey, actually Solidity is very constrained. EVM is a very constrained environment. We should try to move as much off chain as possible and still just minimize what's on chain to what's absolutely necessary, right? So Gelato V2 then already was basically much more like microservices in the backend and so on, like a complete re-architecture. And I think the first big customer we had for the V1 still was like Instadep. Actually, they were one of our first users back then, for like crazy automated deleveraging and moving debt from Compound to Aave and DYDX and so on and so on to like interest rate arbitrage and whatnot. But yeah, the V2 then really gained quite a lot of adoption with, especially like, you know, I think in 2021 we had this amazing phase where like everybody started using our automation tools. Like everybody was using it for limit orders like Pancake Swap, Quick Swap. For those of you who remember Phantom, Spooky Swap, Spirit Swap, many more swaps all used Gelato for limit orders. We had pretty much every yield protocol like Beefy, Yearn, and so on, using Gelato automation for harvesting yield and compounding it. And then so many more projects like rebasing coins and I mean, Optimism, I think MakerDAO, all of them use Gelato. And then, to be honest, like at some point we also saw the first other big projects seeing our success and also you know, putting their own solutions in the market. Like I think Chainlink Automate at some point launched, and even Andre Cronje, who was actually one of our first, I think one of the first guys that chilled us a bit when it was just, you know, two of us, and he somehow found us in 2020 or so and chilled us a bit, but he had his thing going and so on. So that was validation for us that we weren't like completely stupid, right? Like big other existing companies also started doing it or found us. But yeah, we were able to completely remain dominant in the automation market to this day. But yeah, then at some point where we also saw that relaying, like gasless relaying, was becoming a thing. We'd already like had Gelato out, and there was this thing called gas station network. Nowadays, you can basically call it 437. The same guys who did gas station network are now doing 437. And yeah, we also saw this. It never really made sense to us because on Ethereum it was just too expensive to sponsor gas. But then when Polygon came along and so on, we actually saw this as also an interesting market. So we also Gelato was very amenable to that. So we also basically offered gasless transaction relaying, which was integrated by Connex, for example. So pretty much every Connex bridge transaction went through Gelato in the last 2.5 years. And from there, we like essentially the next version of automation was a completely serverless version, which we called like functions, to liken it to cloud functions or AWS Lambda functions in the cloud, right? So this is just like the OG Gelato Automate, but now really the difference for developers was instead of just writing Solidity code, you were able to write your own TypeScript code, connect to APIs, connect to like oracles off-chain and whatnot, and now automate your smart contracts based on off-chain data. So a lot of projects that were doing yield harvesting and then basically selling the yield every day were constrained because they were only able to dump it on Uniswap, which didn't give them the best execution, right? So these users, basically, we took their feedback on board, and that's what led us to build functions where now they were able to automate their yield smart contracts, but they were able to off-chain get 1-inch payloads, right? And then execute their order on 1-inch in an automated way for the protocol. So much better execution for them. And then once we had all of this, like, actually, you asked about Arrakis. Somewhere in between, even like around, like even before Relay, we had one of like limit orders were one of the biggest things that took off. But another big thing that took off on Gelato Automate was Gelato Uniswap. So when Uniswap v3 came out, it was pretty obvious that before LPing was completely passive, right? Like along the whole curve. So you just put your money in. But that didn't, was very capital inefficient. So Uniswap v3 came out and added these concentrated ranges, right? So what this essentially meant is that you had to be a sophisticated trader to essentially move your liquidity around the price to always be there making markets. And this was non-trivial for the normal LP. So what we essentially built is an automated protocol for doing so, where LPs could pool into, and then Gelato would sort of move their positions around and also made them fungible again. That was another thing Uniswap v3 removed the fungibility of the LP tokens. We reintroduced that, and that just like literally we assigned one Solidity developer in our team who joined us very early on, Ari Cassandra. He's now the CTO and co-founder of Arrakis. He actually was the only guy pretty much working on this project. Of course, Hilma and I were also involved. But yeah, and it just like took off like crazy. There was at some point MakerDAO made it a collateral. Then people leveraged up on it, and we had like suddenly 2 billion TVL in there, and we were like, wait a second, this is not really infrastructure. This is more like DeFi stuff. What are we doing with this? It doesn't really match Gelato's profile. It doesn't match the token profile. It doesn't match the risk profile. It has to be its own thing, right? So we were thinking, should we shut it down? That seemed like a bad idea because so many projects were using it, right? Like, would be sad to shut it down. Do we sell it? We had some talks, but the offers were like not good enough. And then we just said, okay, let's make a spin out here and give it its own life. And yeah, to this day, like now Arrakis is actually also growing right now.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, they're working on a lot of cool things. More, I think, just follow that project as well, if you don't already. And but it's a completely separate project now, and a separate team and a separate roadmap and everything. But they're still heavily using Gelato for various things, for automating stuff and so on.
It's crazy, man. I remember, we talked about this, I think maybe in Istanbul or somewhere, when we were driving in a taxi from a party to another party. And I was just amazed that when I was leading business in the graph ecosystem, almost everyone I'd talked to that was using the graph, and there were thousands of dApps using it. It's just like, well, yeah, of course we use Gelato. What else would we use? And that was cool to see it from the other side, as opposed to like the push model. It's like the pull. When everyone's using it, it just becomes kind of a default part of the stack. I think it's really amazing what you've done. And
Thanks.
Now you mentioned, fast forwarding to now, it seems like Rollup as a service, is becoming a big part of your growth strategy going forward. And a couple questions here, starting with, what even made you want to build out the RAS offering? Meaning, was it something you'd always planned to do, or was it something that was more in response to demand you were seeing and the need for this type of service?
Definitely the latter, but in general, I've been very much into crypto tech since 2017, right? So I've always been following the latest stuff in crypto. I even met Joseph Poon in San Francisco in like 2017, end of 2017. He was like, I think, the guy behind Plasma originally. I don't know what happened to him actually. Like back then, there was a time when Joseph Poon was like a big guy for some period of time. So I'd always been following, like always been listening to the Zero Knowledge FM podcast, which I like because they're very technical, but also the Bankless podcast back then and so on, like, and just online on Twitter and elsewhere, like following the Plasma Group stuff, following what Optimism did, and all of these guys, like this Giorgio's guy who's at Paradigm, right? Like he always was a resource that I went to that I really enjoyed, and I think he was very much in the Rollup space there as well. And I'd always been reading the lore and the literature, and one thing that made it clear for me was, I'd already been using Arbitrum and Optimism when they went live and so on. But one thing that I realized early in 2023, so like a year ago, a bit more than a year ago, we did some research, but yes, also we got some user feedback, like people starting to launch their own chains and so on. And then we really wanted to understand as well how rollups work. So we did some deep dives on how OP Stack works and this and that. Saw some really cool talks from Carl, like about the super chain vision and so on. So I was like very pilled. The Arbitrum guys also gave amazing talks, and then of course Polygon was leading in the way with ZK and so on. So I was following all of that. And then definitely one thing that got me hooked was like, okay, our existing user base basically asking us, hey, like we want to launch a chain here and there. And then it became pretty obvious that, first of all, we wanted to do it, like because there was amazing new technology. And if you remember earlier in our conversation, what I told you is that I had this unlock before in Gelato from V1 to V2, where when I was still actively coding on it, when I was still Git pusher, right? Like then there, during this time, I told you that one of the earliest unlocks I had was that actually smart contracts EVM is very constrained environment. And as a developer, you try to move as much off-chain as possible to better technologies that are less limited and only keep the minimum on-chain. And this is very similar with rollups, because really what they are saying is, let's move all of the execution of Ethereum off-chain. Yes, it's still a blockchain and so on, but technically it's like you're moving it away from Ethereum, and you only keep what's necessary on chain. Like you keep the data, right? Like on a chain like Avail or on Ethereum, right? You keep the state commitments, like that on chain, the settlement sort of, right? And maybe a ZK proof with that or a fraud proof thing. And that resonated so much with me, because already earlier in my career, even before rollups even were a thing, I was already realizing that just for our Gelato protocol, it was much better to move much more logic off-chain and try to minimize what you do on-chain. And for me, rollups were just the epitome of that. Blockchains themselves moving off-chain, like in a virtual blockchain sense, right? Blockchains inside blockchains, this kind of stuff. So super resonated with me. And it became socially acceptable to do this, right? Like that was the other thing I saw on the market. Suddenly OP Stack and Arbitrum and whatnot, and they were all doing the cool thing. So like, yeah, you're running a single sequencer server, but that somehow became acceptable. Now, of course, I'm hoping that fraud proofs and ZK proofs and so on will actually mature. And at one point, it's really clear that this is also super safe and inheriting the base layer security. But I think we are on a pretty good way there. And yeah, and then at some point the user demand just like we didn't have another choice. Like I wanted to, but also we had no choice. Even today, like for all of our services and so on that we provide, it's so much easier for us to do this as a rollup as a service provider than talking to another rollup as a service provider. We had these conversations as well, and they didn't really go that well. So like I wouldn't want to have to talk to them and convince them to use our Web3 functions. No, if I can bundle it up with the block space, that's so much better, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And on that same topic, you mentioned, of course, people have to pick the stack that they're building. So, Polygon CDK, Orbit from Arbitrum, OP Stack, ZK Sync's got hyperchains coming out, Starkware's got Mandara. and there's others, and even Cosmos chains and other chains and different VMs are getting into the modular space. You mentioned DA, like Avail. What other pieces of the stack are people needing? What else comes with a RAS offering? Because you're essentially wrapping it up and wrapping a bow around it. What other parts of the stack are involved there?
Yeah, so definitely all of the services on top, and people maybe underestimate this a bit, but for me, like the chain itself, yeah, it's super cool. It's all in development right now. We have these new technologies like Avail coming to the market this year, right? And so on. But at some point, these are very low level technologies and that at some point hopefully will sort of just work. They will sort of ossify. There will be these amazing decentralized networks, right? They will have to scale still a bit more, but I suppose Avail is already using some state-of-the-art scaling technology, right? Like it's already a very different blockchain to what we've seen like in the past, right? So I think really it really depends on what you want to build on top. Like a lot of people right now, they just want to launch L2s. They want to try to replicate the success of Base or similar, right? And just have another sort of ecosystem play. And they just sort of want everything maybe that their developers might find useful, but yeah, an app chain developer, a Rollup developer will have some very concrete needs, right? Like they need maybe this Oracle or like some people build their apps around the layer 0 standard, for example, or so. So sometimes they come to you and they basically say, hey, like, I need this and that for my application to function. And usually these are like, it starts with oracles and bridges. Of course, I'm indexing, like indexer, what the graph does and Gaussian and so on. That's a given anyways, right? Like you usually need that and explorers and so on. But on top of that, it's really a question of oracles, bridges, on-ramps, connection to exchanges, connection to like credit card systems, wallet as a service, maybe account abstraction SDKs, all of these things. And the problem with most of them is they come from this world of Ethereum, BNB chain, Polygon, Arbitrum, where there were like 3-4 chains, and they maybe didn't foresee that there will be like an unlimited number of chains at some point. So most of these systems are still very unscalable in terms of getting them enabled and live and running. They still involve weeks of onboarding and essentially commercial and governance processes and so on. When we are already living in this world where it's like fully automated everything, right? Like developers at some point shouldn't have to talk to anyone. They shouldn't have to fill in forms and this and that and wait, write Slack messages to get a service. They should just be able to click and buy and sort of have that service available, right, in a self-service manner. Totally. So that's where we need to go, and I think that's actually where there's the most of work still needs to happen, because like I think Avail, for example, and these things, they are already technologies that are permissionless. Like you can already like integrate with them, and it's just code that you need to write and deploy, right? But it's not the same case with oracles and bridges and so on. Like there, you still need to talk to a team, and they still need to be willing to support you and whatnot, right? So yeah, I think that there will be quite a radical sort of disruption there, where the Oracle, bridges, and whatnot projects have to rethink the way they deploy their systems and make them available.
Yeah, that makes sense, and I've heard some of that as well. What about when you look at the Rollup as a service landscape? It's becoming a fairly crowded space, and you've all have actually done a great job of gaining business. But can you talk a bit about what sets a RAS provider apart from others doing something similar in the ecosystem?
Yeah, so Rollup as a service is definitely a super commoditized market. We knew this from the start. We didn't get into it because of the business value. Let's put it this way. Although to be honest, the business isn't too bad either. Like we've definitely done way better revenue in this quarter than we've ever had before. Like much better, like huge growth. But ultimately, like the way I think about it, Rollup as a service in the current crypto market is not the most interesting business in a long-term horizon. Like for Rollup as a service to be a super interesting business, the market has to grow like crazy. And that's just normal for infra. That's very normal. It's the same in Web2 cloud, like Amazon and so on. Like, these are commoditized cloud businesses and margins aren't super high necessarily and so on, right? Like, so ultimately, Rollup as a service for us is just something that is about distribution and making it as easy as possible for our users to build their applications, and we want to be there for them when they build their application in every way that we can, right? So Rollup as a service was just a very easy way for us to do that. Now it's technically not easy, right? Like running these production chains and so on requires a lot of attention, a lot of maintenance, and so on. Like you probably heard what happened there, like with Degen chain and Pirate chain, like 3 days of downtime or something. Like these things can be quite catastrophic. So having that burden on you is not easy at all, right? Like we have Rollup as a service providers really need expert infrastructure teams, and to be honest, that's one thing. Deploying these things at scale is super hard in a reliable manner, but also what makes it even harder is that these stacks aren't that mature, right? Like they're also pretty new experimental tech. They aren't that well tested. They also move pretty fast, so bugs are rampant in them, and many of these things have never been run in all of the configurations that they need to be run. And some of these things haven't seen these super low gas prices, super high transaction TPS environments yet. So the Rollup as a service providers right now are really at the frontier, and they're taking on a lot of risk. And I think so far on the broad spectrum, they have done a pretty good job at launching all of these chains. Anyways, I think the way that I would see us especially differentiated is like we're not just a Rollup as a service provider. We're more like a Web3 cloud platform, Rollup as a service being one key part here. But you can think of it like in AWS, where you select your Linux VMs or whatnot. You select your queues, whatever, and you sort of have AWS functions connecting it all together. Like if you've ever been to one of these AWS reInvent things, just watch one of these presentations, you will see all of these different AWS services that make up modern day SaaS or whatever applications, right, in the cloud. And similarly, Gelato is like, you can pick OP stack if you want that type of execution. You can pick your settlement layer. Do you want to settle on Base? Do you want to settle on Ethereum? Do you want to use Orbit instead? Do you want to use Avail for DA, right? Like, do you want to have a Gelato Web3 function connecting it to Redstone for Oracle data and so on? And this is sort of how you sort of piece it all together to build the best new trading application out there on chain, right? The next Binance on chain, the new ecosystem, whatever it is. So we are the sort of one-stop shop. Apart from that, I think how RaaS providers try to differentiate is just pricing. Is just like a race to the bottom already. Like these test nets that I'm seeing out there, like we're also following suit, right? No, but yeah, they're dirt cheap, and it's definitely subsidized, right? So yeah, but that's not the best way to differentiate. Of course, that's just eating into your margin. Like if you can match it with a lower cost, which of course is a skill, but yeah, I don't think that's what's happening in reality. I think it's just like a price war at this moment. But yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure the market will figure it all out. It's like you said, it's still so early. And what you mentioned about, let's say you're in AWS choosing all these different things under the AWS umbrella. What I love is that this is all happening in the modular realm, right? So maybe taking it to a slightly different topic and just zooming out. A big part of what we're all working on is enabling that modular Web3 future, which means that different types of chains across all types of stacks are being built, similar to, I'd say, to the tens of thousands of microservices that helped the traditional internet scale, and actually how it still scales today. But this roll-up and multi-chain future, it leads to fragmentation of developer experience, user experience, liquidity, and more. Can you talk a little bit about how you all are tackling those problems as a RaaS provider to help make things easier for builders and therefore end users? You might hit some of it already, but would love to hear if you have any other thoughts there.
Yeah, so I mean, this is the typical problem that people point out with the whole roll-up centric roadmap and everything, right? Let me sort of answer your question first in a different way, which is like, I think people are making it more of a problem because they're coming from this very, very Ethereum DeFi last 4 years centric view where everything was about liquidity pools and so on, right? The way I'm already thinking, and I'm sure you guys are too, and at some point also would love to know more about what you guys are doing with Nexus. I haven't looked much into it, but I saw this, it looked really interesting. And in general, I'm also like interested in sovereign rollups, like rollups that are more built around the DA layer per se, and less around like a settlement layer like Ethereum. I think these are very interesting ideas. But yeah, ultimately, basically, I think there's so many use cases out there from developers. They don't care about like whether to be connected to Arbitrum or Ethereum for liquidity. They like it's the same problem on Web 2, right? It's like you don't like go and build you don't stop in building whatever you want to build on AWS because you're going to fragment the space. No, you just build it and you hope that it's useful enough and that you will attract the liquidity, right? Like that's ultimately what you have to do. You have to build something that's useful and valuable enough, and you have to attract that liquidity. You have to attract the users and so on. Like that will never change, I think. So making it easier to have connectivity in this new Internet of Value world that we're building, yeah, sure, that's important. Arguably, we're already way ahead to Web 2. Like, I mean, how do you connect on Web 2? Like, maybe Stripe is the best, but it's also not that great, right? And apart from that, you have like bank transfers or whatnot. Like, how do users interact? Like, maybe Apple Pay nowadays, but it's like all like these guys take huge cuts and huge fees and compliance and permission and whatnot, right? So actually, I think we give ourselves too little credit. Like we're probably already much better in terms of that aspect than our Web 2 counterparts are, but like of course could still be better. ZK bridging, whatnot, all yay will be cool, right? But yeah, so first of all, let me say that I think people should. First of all, it will always be an issue, right? Because even like there's a power law. Like ultimately, there won't be 1,000 huge companies like in crypto as well. There will also be some winners. Some of them there will be a power law, and then there will be a very long trail of services and apps that are still supporting a living of some employees somewhere, right? So that will never change. And then there's also a bunch of use cases that simply don't need it, like in gaming, that they all have their in-game economies and something that don't need much from the outside world. Maybe in an on-ramp, maybe users paying with credit card to buy something in the game. That's it. They don't really care about liquidity elsewhere, right? And now to your actual question, like, so I just feel like sometimes people underestimate how big this part is, and because it hasn't been addressed so far, right? Like so far, Ethereum and so on wasn't able to address it because it didn't scale to this world. Now with these new technologies, this new modular stack, we can for the first time try to address a much broader spectrum of developers and use cases by giving them basically block space for free almost, right? So and one clickable and everything, and the services coming bundled in. So we're for the first time opening ourselves up to these much bigger space of use cases than before, which actually they don't all care about liquidity and fragmentation, right? Like they just want to build something and try it out and see if they can build a cool app. Like, yeah. But then how do we actually solve the problem for for this section of use cases where it is a problem, right? Like DeFi use cases and so on. Yeah, so we're working very closely with OP, for example, on their native interop that's coming up later this year. I think it's basically the first instantiation of the super chain protocol, if you will. So there's stuff in the works there. We're also working very closely with the Espresso team. They're more focused on Arbitrum right now. So we're also looking at shared sequencing there. We're working with other teams on these research areas. So I believe ultimately the holy grail like is something like AggLayer from Polygon, right? Like with ZK rollups, ZK aggregation, and then having something like a shared sequencer, real-time proving. It's very, it's a lot of technologies still have to happen there, but you could probably think in a world where you have a shared sequencer on top of like a DA, and real-time proving for settlement for rollups and so on. You could probably think of a world where market makers then have what they need to allow for basically synchronous flows of liquidity between chains and trades and so on, without taking on that much risk. Yeah. So for this, I think the biggest technology, arguably, that we still need. I mean, shared sequencing is currently quite hot, right? And I think there's a lot of stuff coming on the market this year. But yeah, the biggest thing that everybody is waiting for is, I believe, ZK and real-time proving and so on. That will be probably the last sort of hurdle we have to overcome to then have basically. I don't think every rollup will be connected to each other then even, but at least you can express yourself a bit more. Like you can try and build a cluster, and you can make business relationships with other chains and try to like sort of be shared sequence with them and convince them to use like whatever ZK thing you come up with and so on, right? So
Yeah.
at least it's possible then. And ultimately, I think it will still require a lot of business partnerships to actually take place for it to then actually, happen.
Yeah. And this is something I'm really excited to work with you on with Avail. So Avail obviously has data availability, and then the Nexus is with data availability, you have a validity proof, which essentially verifies a chain state. And then you can aggregate those proofs from a really unlimited number of chains, because even if chains aren't pushing it onto the base layer, we can pull it onto the base layer, have a proof, and you can aggregate those. And if one chain updates with transaction data and or state changes, you can just make another proof that includes that. And that what that does is enable cross-chain interop without a traditional mint and burn bridge aspect. And me is that I participate across a ton of different dApps, across a ton of different chains, and it's a pain. Like, it's a pain for me to mint and burn across all these different things. And it's going to be fun when Nexus, with that validity proof aggregation, enables asynchronous cross-chain communication and liquidity. And then Nexus will have a shared sequencer auction mechanism for synchronous cross-chain liquidity, like you were just talking about. And so it will take care of both of those things, because imagine like Stripe, it has a bunch of different services that one takes the order, one passes it here, it has to go through here, and eventually it goes through and it gets paid. Like, aside from just liquidity, if we're really rebuilding the internet, we need to have that level of communication across rollups, which are essentially little microservices. A lot of general purpose, but some will be microservices. And so that's what I'm really excited about, because I get to work on a use case that's going to benefit me across a bunch of different chains and protocols.
Sounds really cool. And I know that Avail is differentiated as a DA layer because you guys already have like a bit more, how would I say, like maybe a bit more forward compatibility with ZK stuff. Is that a correct way of putting it, sort of?
Yeah, Avail DA uses mechanisms like 4844, so it uses KZG polynomial commitments and validity proofs, which is the 4844 mechanisms there. And also, as an external DA layer, it was built using Substrate, which enables a lot higher number of validators, so up to 1,000 validators. But just the ability to do sampling quickly via mathematical guarantees, as opposed to waiting for like an optimistic, so just crypto economic security fraud proof style things, to be really sure that with the light client you can sample and have guarantees of data availability in 40 seconds, so 2 block times. So yeah, it's and then with the Nexus stuff, it kind of works out of the box because of the validity proofs with ZK Tech. And then it's we've also figured out with optimistic proofs, so we're using storage proofs, so it'll be like execution proofs, I think, and ordering proofs. I can't remember the 2 types of proofs, but those are figured out. But then we need to figure out the crypto economic mechanism for the optimistic chains. But it's, we pretty much have the tech figured out. And then you think of any other type of chain, it's really going to be cross VM, completely chain and tech stack agnostic, because it'd be fun. Like, the idea is, if I'm on one chain, I'm used to being there, but I want something on another chain, I just put out my intent, it goes into an escrow vault, and then an app chain, it has this order book matching engine that matches up all these different orders, finds a coincidence of once, and then I don't have to mint and burn across all these different chains to get it and then bridge back. So that's going to be a huge level up. It's something that hasn't been built before, and it could be coming live the next couple of months. So I'm really excited to kind of bring it.
Is this all like the one that you just mentioned with the intents and so on? Is that also part of Nexus, or?
So the business logic of things, for example, a DEX that will be using this, they'll be building their business logic in Rust. They'll be using provers, external provers, like you mentioned, let's say Risk Zero or Succinct's SP1. Starkware's got some really good tech. So still figuring out what that best mechanism, but it won't all be just out of the box with Nexus. It'll be all these different Legos and then business logic that has to be written and so on. But Nexus will be the infrastructure that really enables that, with that chain, literally unlimited chain state verification for asynchronous and then synchronous stuff with shared sequencers.
Super interesting. Like, I definitely have to read up on Nexus. I just saw a tweet. I didn't have time to read any like deeper dive papers yet on it, but But yeah, the tweet sounded pretty cool, and yeah, I mean, DA is just very interesting because it's just a new, I mean, interestingly, like going back to the basics of blockchain somehow, but it's just a new way to think about blockchains again, like I guess, right? Like and L2s and yeah, a new way to also build rollups, I would say. Of course, you can use Avail for DA with a normal OP chain, but you can also just build a rollup differently that is sort of more enshrined, I guess, or sovereign on a Avail, right? Like, so that, I think that's also super interesting just to think about.
Yeah, I agree. We're 50 minutes in, 45 minutes in, so I want to get to a few last questions, then we'll wrap it up. But
Yeah.
we've already covered a ton. We'll close it out with just a couple quick questions, really on what you're thinking about the future. So maybe to start, can you share like any type of alpha on what's coming next for Gelato, either in the near, mid, or long-term future?
Yeah. So we are first of all spending a bunch of time for our community to give them more ways to use Gel, the Gelato network token. There's going to be some stuff coming there. I think in the summer already, stuff that the community has very long been waiting for. And yeah, so hopefully they're happy there that they can use their Gel for more things. That's one thing that's more imminent. Then we're doing a bunch of research and development and like chain interop, shared sequencing, like more than happy to work more with you guys on this as well, like, of course. Yeah, so I think that's a very interesting area for the rest of the year, where you will probably see some test nets from us with Espresso and Arbitrum or OP interop and so on. Maybe we can also work on a test net with you guys for what you guys are cooking up there. So yeah, I think that's sort of where my mind would be. Sort of like to your thing, like the fragmentation. Maybe I wouldn't even express it like so. For me, it's more about UX. So having easier ways for chains to connect with each other and move assets between each other. And actually, I think this stuff is going to be mostly built for the acrosses and the Stargates and so on, right? Like these, and actually Connex, the project that we've been working with for a long time. I think they are actually. I don't want to front run their announcement, but they are also building something really cool that I think we will also support and work with. But yeah, so I'm actually looking again at cross-chain interop this year and so on, because now the players in there aren't just the off-chain Oracle attester networks like the layer zeros and the chainlinks and whatnot, right? It's more like actually now the rollup sequencers themselves are sort of entering the room, the chat room, right? And they're suddenly also building tech that can be used by liquidity providers and so on to make markets across chain.
Yep.
So yeah, this is what I'm really interested in, I think. And apart from that, our product, like we wanted to have all sort of things one clickable already at the start of the year, like one click this, one click that, one click OP, one click Arbitrum on base, one click this, thing and that. But actually, we were sort of, we had to hire, we had to grow the team because we had so many chain launches now that we were fully strapped in making sure that the production environment is as reliable as possible for our users, right? So that we wouldn't have any downtime there and so on. So that was our main focus. But now that the team has grown a bit, we finally have time to work more on the product. So that's another big thing that's coming up soon. We will announce in June, but we will soon have the best sort of one-click RAS product experience on the market. And we've been long waiting for it. So soon developers can come and they can, have all sorts of configurations on testnet in a one-click way, and they can play around without talking to us. At some point, I would hope that everyone starts talking to us, because I still don't think you should launch a mainnet without talking to someone about it, maybe getting some advice. I think in the future everything will be one-clickable, like mainnets as well, but I think it's just a bit too early for the mainnet. Like there, you should really, it's a bit of a gimmick to do that. Like I think there you should really talk to someone who's an expert there as well, like get some back and forth going and for what you want to achieve exactly with the chain and what setup is needed and so on. Yeah, but ultimately it will all be automated. That I'm sure of.
Yeah. Well, on that topic, last thing is, we'll wrap it up. If people want to go learn more about Gelato or even reach out to start building with you or even just have initial conversation, where should they be going?
So I'm maybe the wrong guy to ask this. I wish our developer advocate was here. I mean, just go to gelato.network, I guess. That's the website. That should include all the links. So gelato.network, on Twitter, of course, at Gelato Network. I'm, by the way, at Git Pusher. I should probably rebrand my name. That was from the time when I was still pushing Git, but my GitHub commit history is pretty sad, to be honest. So I should probably rebrand to something else. I guess I'm Rasputin now, right? Like the play on Rust, but
Yep.
So at Git Pusher is me on social. At Gelato Network is the company building the stuff on social. And Gelato.network, and we have our developer docs, we have our app, our RAS app, but I don't know the URLs off the top of my head right now.
I think you gave good enough direction. So love it.
Gelato.network, definitely. That's probably a good place to start as well.
Thanks so much for being here, man. I'm just really excited to continue working together. And of course, thanks to everyone who joined or is going to hear this conversation in the future. Luis, thanks for being here and hope you have a good weekend.
Thanks, Kyle. It was great being here, and I hope we can have another one and the next time talk more about Nexus and what you guys are cooking up there. Sounds super great.
Yeah, man. Let's do it.